Good evening. I'm Warren Hogue, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this Distinguished Author Series event featuring Nicholas Kristof, op-ed columnist for the New York Times and co-author with his wife, Sheryl WuDunn, of A Path Appears, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunity. One housekeeping note at the outset: please turn off your cell phones or other noise-making devices except for those of you who would like to tweet this event, something we encourage. The operative hashtag is IPINST. That's IPINST. And I intend to end this event ahead of time so that those of you who purchase the book, which is for sale at the door, will have a chance to get Nick to sign it and chat with you afterwards. Let me start by saying that I'm sorry that Sheryl cannot be here tonight because, like Nick, she is someone I have known and admired for a long time. That said, it is a distinct personal and professional pleasure for me to have Nick here at IPI. Nick has done a remarkable, almost revolutionary thing with the traditional form of the New York Times column. While maintaining that form's integrity, professional distance, and credibility, he has injected it with personality and passion. And a good illustration of that are two recent columns. One was on the life and death of a childhood friend of his from Yamhill, Oregon, which he wrote to illustrate the ignorance and indifference of many in affluent America to the struggles of the poor among us who survive on food stamps and disability payments. It was entitled, "Where's the Empathy?" The other took up the tabloid subject of the apparent transition of American Olympic decathlon champion Bruce Jenner into becoming a woman, and used it as a way of highlighting the misunderstanding of transgender issues. I can tell you from personal experience that no New York Times columnist during the 3 decades that I worked at the paper ever dared venture into such subjects and causes. This is a tribute to Nick and what he has wrought with his column. And of course, with his skill using the tools of social media and collaborating with public television, he has broadened and sharpened the impact of his writing immeasurably. By the way, he has 1.6 million Twitter followers. Nick also goes to the most remote locations where the most horrible abuses lurk and applies a particularly assertive approach to exposing them and combating them. We all remember, for instance, his personal interventions in Southeast Asia to rescue young women from brothels and sex traffickers. And finally, just to make sure that the activist journalism he embodies takes hold and spreads into a new generation, he annually takes selected young writers with him on his reporting trips so that they can see for themselves what socially committed journalism is and what it can accomplish. That is the instinct that has prompted this book. A Path Appears is a primer on the art of giving, and it tells the stories of people and organizations around the world who have made a significant difference in the lives of others less fortunate than they. It shamelessly proselytizes for the act of giving, complete with a chapter on a giving code, a list of 6 steps you can take in the next 6 minutes, addresses of organizations you can contact, the causes they represent, and what an individual donation can mean to an individual on the other side of the world. And then, to seal the deal, he includes mention of behavioral studies that prove that the act of giving is so beneficial for the giver that it can make you feel as good as having sex. Now, with that, I fear I'm stealing Nick's best lines. So I'm going to turn it over to him, let him tell you himself. Ladies and gentlemen, Nick Kristof.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much. And what I should add is that Warren was my first foreign editor at the New York Times. When I joined the paper, he was foreign editor, and then he he chose me to be the Hong Kong bureau chief, sent me off to fulfill my dream of becoming a foreign correspondent. But the actual story of how that came about, I actually only disclosed to Warren very recently. What happened was that I was the Los Angeles correspondent. I was at my desk, and at that time, the New York Times the computer system was such that editors, when they would write memos, they would write them on their own computer, and they'd be saved on a central server every 6 minutes. And so Warren was writing a letter to Abe Rosenthal, the executive editor at the time, and about changes he perceived he wanted to have in the foreign staff of the New York Times. And there were a bunch of clerks who were friends of mine who knew the passwords to get in and see everything. And so every 6 minutes, so I got this call saying, Warren Hogue is writing a memo right now, and he's proposing to send you to Hong Kong. And then a couple of other folks called, and every 6 minutes I was getting an update on this memo. And so about a week later, Warren called up and said, Nick, this will come out of the blue, but would you be interested in going to Hong Kong? And I...
Did you gasp?
I really tried hard to gasp. Wow, that's a surprise. Yes. But I admired Warren very much as a colleague at the Times, and I very much admired the work of IPI here, which of course is very much in line with the things that I'm trying to write about. So let me tell you a little bit about how it is that Sheryl and I came to write our latest book. And Sheryl sends her regrets. She's out in California. Makes us wonder a little bit what our high school daughter is doing right now, probably having a wild party at her house. It came about because our last book, Half the Sky, was really about empowering women elsewhere. And after we would talk about it, people would always come up to us and say, well, what about the U.S.? And what can I do? And it does seem to us that there's this real yearning on the part of so many people to try to make a difference, to try to find a little more purpose or meaning in life for ourselves, or maybe because we want to model that behavior for our kids. I'm sure a lot of you are immensely well-traveled. You probably have the same kind of experience that we've had. Sheryl and I have been trying to raise our empathetic kids, and I remember one time taking Caroline, maybe when she was in 8th grade, through Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and it was a little dicey. There were these gang checkpoints, and we'd get through one, and there'd be this little breather till we got to the next. And in one of these slight lulls, she turned to me and said, "Dad, when my friends go on vacation, they go to the Caribbean." And we thought that she had a point. Actually, Sheryl and I, indeed, for our next family vacation, we went to the Caribbean. We went to Haiti during the cholera outbreak. And, you do what you can to try to instill some of these efforts in families, but I think there's still a lot of skepticism about whether somebody can make a difference. The problems seem too vast. I think there are worries about corruption and inefficiency, problems like one saw with 3 cups of tea, I think feed that kind of doubt. And in fact, it does seem to us that there are a couple of things that really give one greater confidence now that one can have more of an impact and a stronger impact. And also, in many ways, a more, if you will, fun impact. I think that one innovation is the new platforms on the web that enable one to incorporate giving in different ways. And I think that giving used to be what we did at the end of the year with a checkbook, especially for young people. It's really much more of a daily kind of thing. It's not just where you write checks to. It's where you shop. It's the brands you buy. It may be the company that you choose to work at. It's the gifts you give. One of the, I think in our household, my most prized Father's Day gift came a few years ago with an organization, and if any of you have heard of it, called Apopo. They they train these giant Gambian pouched rats, which are 3 feet long, these huge rats that are long-lived and have an excellent sense of smell. And are very trainable. They teach them how to sniff out landmines, and also they're too light to set off mines. And in 2 hours, they can demine as much area as a human deminer can in 2 days. And they also train them to detect tuberculosis in a sputum in a little petri dish. And so my kids got me a giant Gambian pouched rat through a popo. They trained my rat. And I didn't take possession of it, but somewhere in Angola right now, a Kristof rat is running around demining parts of Angola. And that was so much more fulfilling for a giver and givee than one more necktie would have been. And I think that, and there are lots of platforms like that, but I think the other thing that is new has been a much greater sense of rigor and evidence about what works, what doesn't work. And the arrival of randomized controlled trials in testing interventions abroad and at home has been so important. Testing anti-poverty interventions as if they were pharmaceutical trials. And they teach us new things about what works and what doesn't work. I see it because as a journalist, people are always coming to me and saying, you should write about my brilliant program in Tanzania. And we've done this great self-evaluation that shows it's so effective. Every self-evaluation history of every aid organization has always shown it to be a wild success. But with the randomized controlled trial by outsiders, it really does give one much greater confidence this is something real. And it's taught us some things we thought worked turned out not to work so well. There was a lot of excitement, you may remember, about microlending. When microloans were tested using randomized controlled trials, we found that they helped, but only quite modestly. They weren't the breakthrough that people had hoped for. On the other hand, micro savings programs turned out really to be truly revolutionary, helping people save tiny amounts of money. There was a huge excitement some years ago about clean cook stoves in the developing world as a way of improving the health of women who cook rather than open cook fires, saving wood that is being used in these open fires, and so on. Well, again, when the present model of clean cook stoves were carefully tested with the randomized control trial, it turned out they had zero impact on the health of the people using them. They work great in a particular experiment. The moment you scale them up, they didn't work at all. They had zero impact. Maybe at some point down the road, they will. You know from my column that I'm a huge believer in education. And we tend to think that the most cost-effective way of getting an extra child in school is you build schools, bricks and mortar. If you do it through bricks and mortar, the cost of one additional child in the school system is $350 per marginal child. There's another intervention that brings that down to $3.50. Any guesses about what that is from somebody who hasn't read the book? It's a health intervention. It has to do with a medicine that might well be in some of your homes, but that probably very few of you have taken. Any guesses? Deworming. We don't think about deworming because hopefully our kids don't have intestinal parasites. Around the world, many of them do. And actually, American kids were dewormed 100 years ago by the Rockefeller Foundation. Had this major impact on kids because if you have intestinal parasites, you're more anemic, you're more sick, you miss more school. And this is something that is resolved with a 5-cent albendazole pill. And the same insights in terms of what works that we see in this country. Family planning is something that tends to get neglected, partly because it's been caught up in the toxic politics of reproductive health. In the United States, 30% of American girls become pregnant by age 19. 30%. And that's actually after it's come down dramatically since 1991. 30%. There have been a number of programs in Missouri, one ongoing in Colorado, that use long-acting reversible contraceptives and show that one can dramatically reduce teen pregnancy rates. It turns out that indeed that American teenagers, as far as we can tell, don't have sex any more often than European teenagers, but get pregnant about 2 or 3 times as often. And that's because we don't have as good comprehensive sex education. We don't have as good access to contraceptives. And those programs that have been introduced on a really carefully evaluated basis save money more than 5 times over, save public funds more than 5 times over. So I think this research has kind of given us a much better sense of where we can intervene abroad and at home to make a difference. I think one of my frustrations, and one reason why Sheryl and I wrote the book, is that while this evidence has accumulated, we tend not to rely on it. We tend not to follow it. And I mean, there's overwhelming evidence, as you may know, that early interventions matter, that intervening in the first 1,000 days, beginning conception, has enormous returns and helps create greater opportunity. And yet, we can never build the political will to establish even universal pre-K. And I sometimes wonder if one of the challenges here isn't an empathy gap. And you see this in various ways. And in the US, the wealthiest 20% of Americans donate less to charity than the poorest 20% as a fraction of incomes. Susan Fisk at Princeton University did some fascinating work on brain scans of successful people, looking at images of people who were less successful, who were poor or homeless. And she found that the brains of successful people processed those images as if they were looking not at people, but at things. And when that happens, it's going to be harder to feel that empathy, to want to do something, to want to intervene, to make a difference. And one can construct these narratives about personal irresponsibility that we hear a lot about. When I think about why it is that the wealthiest 20% are less generous as a fraction of income, it's not intrinsically that the affluent are any less benevolent or less good than anybody else, but it seems to be that if you are affluent in America today, you are to some degree insulated from need. You tend to live in a nice neighborhood, your friends and acquaintances tend to be reasonably well off, and so you're not daily confronted by need. In contrast, if you were poor in America today, then every day you encounter people who were needier than you, and so you respond. And this is where those of us in the media industry and any of us can try to bring into people's living rooms or bring before people kind of real people who can use that help to try to chip away at that empathy gap. And to some extent, that's what we're trying to do with the Path of Peers. And just one note on the media on that access, on that point. Let me maybe just end with that. One of the things that really troubles me is that on so many of these issues, domestic and global, it's hard for me to see how they get addressed unless we in the media help project them on the agenda. You think of, I was talking with a couple of folks a moment ago about Syrian refugees. That issue has essentially disappeared from television screens. And when it has disappeared, it's not going to get addressed. Central African Republic has vanished. South Sudan, totally gone. I did the calculations last fall, and at that point, on the evening network television shows in the U.S., South Sudan had 3 minutes of collective coverage over the course of 2014, and the MH17 airliner had 300 minutes. I'm afraid that as we in the media drop the ball on these issues, the will to address them falls away. And one of the things that I found most demoralizing as a journalist was a few years ago, the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, essentially bribed ABC News to cover global health stories to cover important, global health and nutrition. They didn't. Officially, it wasn't called a bribe. Officially, it was called a grant. But that's essentially what it was. And so it was controversial within the development community, because why should the Gates Foundation be spending scarce resources not to vaccinate kids or provide bed nets to keep people alive, but rather to pay overpaid television executives to do what they should be doing anyway? And yet, over that year, the ABC News really did some fine work. They did pieces on vitamin A deficiency, on maternal mortality, micronutrients, and this helped elevate those issues. And so the Gates Foundation went back and said, okay, we'd like to renew our bribe grant. And ABC News said, no, we don't want to take the money, because we can see that from our metrics that when we run these important stories, that's when people are switching the channel, to a rival that puts a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and has them yell at each other. And I find that truly kind of dispiriting. At a time when everybody is desperate for ratings, I fear that if you think we've done a lousy job covering some of these global humanitarian issues in the last 15 years, just wait for the next 15. That's my fear. And that was partly why we wrote A Path Appears. And, I would just ask you that we all have our own little spotlights in some form, whether it's our workplace or our book club or our place of worship or a dinner table or our Facebook account. And, as we drop the ball, I hope that all of you will help pick it up. And with that,
Thanks.
Glad to make it a conversation.
Come sit down. I'm going to talk with Nick a little bit about the book. In particular, as I said, it is a book of stories. I mean, after all, that's what Nick and I have done for a living, is telling stories. And there were a couple of, I wondered if you can remember the details enough to tell, for instance, the story of Charity Water.
Yeah.
That's a great story that involves all the things that you're writing about in the book. Could you just
That's right.
tell the story of Charity Water?
Yeah, so, one of the Charity Water stories involves a girl named Rachel Beckwith, who is on, you can't really see it, but, actually right under the IPI sign.
Right. There's a bigger picture of it inside.
But so Rachel, 8-year-old girl in Seattle, hears from her church about how their kids who don't have clean water is upset. She decides to donate her 9th birthday through Charity Water to raise funds for wells in Ethiopia. So it's sort of a design. You set up a page. She set a goal of raising $300, and in lieu of presents, asked for donations to that page. She was bummed out that she only managed to raise $220, and then a few weeks after her birthday, she was in a very bad car accident. People, friends of the family, people in the community wanted to show their solidarity with Rachel and her family. They didn't know what else to do, so they went to her birthday page and began donating. So the total quickly flew past that $300 goal, past $1,000, past $5,000. And as Rachel is fighting for her life in the hospital, her parents are able to whisper to her that she has had a new Charity Water birthday record by beating the record that Justin Bieber had previously set. But in the end, Rachel died. She did not make it. And that made people want all the more to commemorate her big heart. Word went out through social media about Rachel's last fundraiser. People ended up donating $1.2 million, enough for water for 37,000 people in Ethiopia. And, her mom said that obviously there's nothing that can fill that hole in your life when you've lost a 9-year-old daughter, but that at least it provided a way not only of commemorating Rachel, but of providing an overlay of meaning or purpose on an event that had just seemed so frustratingly and absurdly random. And Charity Water is one of those organizations that I think has done an amazing job on the web, providing people with tools to feel that kind of fulfillment and engagement and direct connection to those they give to.
Now, I wrote myself some notes here from the book about things you believe in as far as not so much best practices, the best way to get the message across. And in some cases, you're saying that publicity, Instagram, things like that are really important. And I think I remember you said, don't lowball it. I mean, don't do it in sort of a cheap fashion. I mean, the Gates Foundation, as you just said, did it through ABC, which was a high quality way of doing it. But I actually got the list of them right here. Can you remember some of those?
Sure. So my assistant for a while at the Times was doing the cosmetics column. And so she was getting inundated by, the world's best marketers trying to, say how important this kind of lipstick, this shade of lipstick was going to be. And meanwhile, there are people reaching out to me about girls' education or bed nets or vitamin A supplementation. And, it was done sloppily with no sense of what would work. And I think there is a sense among humanitarians that these causes are too important to be marketed. We're flinching at the idea of marketing. It is so much more important to market things that matter than to market lipstick. And I think that I think there's a lot that the humanitarian world can learn from the business world in that vein about how to connect with things. There have been a million videos done about the importance of girls, investing in girls. Evidence overwhelming about this. Nobody ever watches these videos. And then Nike did a 2-minute video called The Girl Effect that was done by their professional advertising firm that sells the swooshes. And they produced a brief video that I think at last count 15 or 20 million people had seen. So I think that, I think there's a message here for us about the importance of marketing and not flinching at it.
Nick, the God Gulf. What's the God Gulf?
There are so many religious organizations that do a fabulous job on humanitarian issues, and there are so many secular organizations that do a fabulous job. And particularly in the U.S., the mutual suspicions and recriminations are so great that there is negligible cooperation. And the upshot is that far less is accomplished. And I think that it would be good for everybody if they, agreed to disagree on plenty of issues and sought those areas where they can actually find common ground and push on those. If you look at those movements that have succeeded versus those that didn't, one of the common threads of those that worked was that they were broad. They really ran the political spectrum. And I think that that's something we don't try hard enough to do today.
Nick, I'm looking around this room, the blonde wood, the glass behind us, the white walls, the birch tree, the bust of Trygve Lie outside. You may not have seen that. This is named for Trygve Lie, first Secretary General of the UN. I mention all that because you talk in the book about something called the Nordic model.
For trafficking, on sex trafficking, yeah. Sex trafficking is an issue that I've written a lot about. I became interested in it. Originally, I thought I was going to write one article about this when I was in Asia, and then, came across these young girls in Cambodia who were locked up in brothels, and it was clear that this was exactly like 19th century slavery, except they were going to be dead of AIDS by their 20s. And then I began writing about it more in India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines. And then I became interested in the situation here in the U.S. And I think that, a lot of the debate about women's rights in the U.S. is focusing on things like pay equity, board representation, political representation. Those are real issues. But it sure seems to me that two of the most important issues that don't get adequate attention are domestic violence, claiming 3 women's lives every day, and sex trafficking. 100,000 underage girls each year in the U.S. trafficked into the sex trade, and no country has solved this problem. It's not a problem one can really solve as such, but I think that the Nordic model has been maybe more effective than most, and that essentially is to decriminalize the sale of sex, but arrest the buyers of sex. So essentially, women who are in the sex trade in Sweden, which was the pioneer of it, are steered towards social services, and men are arrested and fined. And what this does essentially is it reduces demand by creating a penalty, and by reducing demand, it in turn reduces the trafficking that fuels it. Doesn't resolve it, but it reduces the scale of the problem. And there's now interest in a number of other countries in Europe and in the U.S. in pursuing that model. I think we should.
Nick, you mentioned William Easterly, somebody probably known to some of you, a distinguished academic at NYU, I think. And Easterly believes questions the validity of aid in generating self-sustaining economic growth. Basically, it's criticism of the charity industry. Talk about what you think of his analysis, and do you have a response to it?
Sure. I think it's true that there are a lot of doubts about how effective aid has been to generate economic growth. It's very hard to disentangle causes and effects, and so mostly we have correlations, and they're not very impressive. But it's also true that this is not something that we've hugely tried to do. I mean, often the motivation of our aid programs has been to keep some corrupt dictator in power. But where I guess I would, so Easterly takes this as a reason to be very skeptical of aid generally. And in fact, I think that while aid has not clearly been very effective in speeding up economic growth, it has a pretty strong record of saving lives. And if you look at, with the child mortality revolution, since 1990, about 100 million kids' lives have been saved. And there was concern initially this was going to sort of generate a Malthusian crisis. In fact, as predicted, after child mortality rates dropped, then total fertility rates, the number of babies that a woman will have, dropped as well. Even in Haiti right now, it's less than 3 births per woman in her lifetime, in country after country. And so there has been, aid has clearly been so effective in saving lives, in improving health, improving cognition through nutrition programs, getting more kids in school. I think we haven't been. Often we have a lot more kids going to school, but often to very ineffective schools. There's often questions about what we measure, but I think that aid has a very impressive record in terms of health and education. And I guess I would also say that, more broadly, in addressing some of the things we care most about, nothing works very well. And so, since 9/11, this is maybe IPI is the right place to say this, that since 9/11, we've really tried to address some of these global security problems in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen. We've hugely invested in the military toolbox in that regard. And obviously you need the military toolbox. There's some things that it does that nothing else can do. I think we've also hugely underinvested in the education toolbox, the women's empowerment toolbox. And the trade-offs financially are extraordinary. For the cost of deploying 1 U.S. soldier abroad for 1 year, you can start about 20 schools and fund them for 3 years. And education is no panacea either. But, if I look at countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, until 1971, part of the same country, Bangladesh invested in education after separation. Today, there are more girls in high school in Bangladesh than there are boys. I think that may be one reason why there is less violence and insecurity in Bangladesh than there is in the tribal areas of Pakistan, where female literacy is 3%. And it's not, part of it is just that one of the most destabilizing things in a society is a huge youth bulge in the population. Every extra 1% increment in that youth bulge leads to about an extra 4% risk of violent clashes and civil war. How do you reduce the youth bulge? You educate girls. And likewise, Yemen and Oman, right next door. In the 1960s up to about 1970, Oman was more backward than Yemen. Today, we never hear about Oman. It's nice, boring, stable, exactly what we want countries to be. And in part, that's because of education, including education of girls. I wish, in retrospect, we had done a little bit more of that kind of investment after 9/11.
Nick, let's stay in Bangladesh for a second, because another story that you tell in the book that's so illustrative of so many things is the story of Shakti yogurt. Shakti Doi yogurt, right? Yeah. And the involvement of Muhammad Yunus and the involvement of the Dannon Yogurt Company. Just tell us the story of Shakti and why that works so well.
Yeah. So one of our arguments is that it's important to bring in corporations into these efforts. That we tend to have this false dichotomy where we think nonprofits, noble, good, worthy, for-profits, greedy. It's so much more complicated than that. What matters is impact. And one of the advantages of corporations getting engaged in social space is they have scale. They can have impact. And so in Bangladesh, as you know, there's a huge nutrition problem, a big problem with micronutrient deficiencies, and a big problem with protein deficiencies. Well, how can you get more protein? How can you get more micronutrients to these kids? So Muhammad Yunus thought, maybe yogurt, and he approached Danone, the French yogurt company, and together they set up a yogurt subsidiary in Bangladesh. To provide little cups of yogurt in rural areas. And this was a nightmare of a thing to do because, you need refrigerators, you need electricity, you need cows that produce milk. And I think at the time, the average Bangladeshi cow produced 1/14 as much as the average American cow. And when they tried to put the micronutrients in, it turns out they made the yogurt taste bad. I mean, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And yet they stuck to it. And now they have, now Bangladeshi kids are eating cheap yogurt. It's addressing these protein deficiencies. And it's doing so in a sustainable way because it's a for-profit company that is driving it. It's scalable. I think we need to try to think more about those kinds of models, and also I think push companies to do a better job with their corporate social responsibility efforts, which they brag about, but for the most part, frankly, are pretty much just window dressing.
You and Sheryl underwent brain scans to test your reaction to making charitable donations. Tell us about that.
Sure. So we were interested in the arguments that trying to engage in pro-social activities, trying to help others is good for you, that it makes you feel better, that it makes you live longer. And there's been a lot of population studies on this. If you look at a population, those who give more also tend to live longer. One major study found that being more pro-social, volunteering more, this kind of thing, was more related to longevity than low cholesterol levels. And another study found that for senior citizens, if you join a church or religious organization, your mortality risk drops 29%. If you exercise regularly, your mortality risk drops 30%. If you volunteer regularly, your mortality risk drops 44%. You know, and if you just manage to volunteer for a religious running organization, you live forever. You know, so. But those are correlations, and of course it's hard to. But now you can do brain scans. You can check what is going on in the brain. So we joined a study at University of Oregon that examines where the pleasure centers of the brain, which are these areas that respond to the most primal sensual pleasures. They light up when you eat nice food, when people compliment you, when you have sex, and it. This part of our pleasure centers were getting scanned at the same time that we had this computer monitor in front of us and a clicker, and we were either given money, small gifts of money, or making donations. And indeed, the study found that basically everybody, their pleasure centers would light up when they were making donations. They also light up when you get money, but for about half of Americans, you get more, the pleasure centers light up more when you give than when you get. A
last story I want you to tell us that you tell very effectively in the book, and this may surprise you, I ask you about this, as an illustration of the importance of a small act, a single act, an act you wouldn't think about its importance when you did it, that has great importance. I'm going to mispronounce this name, but save the punchline. The story of Vladislav Kristofovich.
Okay.
Would you tell that? And tell us
Sure.
about it on the book, because there's a wonderful punchline at the end.
Sure. So, the context is that people, they always feel like, yes, I can help somebody. It's just going to be a drop in the bucket. That the problems are too big. And it's true. The problems are too big. We're not going to solve them. But I've certainly come to believe that, that a drop in the bucket is worthwhile, and partly it's because of the story of Vladislav Kristofovich, who Warren mentioned, a World War II refugee, fled Romania, ended up in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia. Then Tito was executing some of these Romanian refugees and letting others flee to the West to try to play Stalin against the West. He wasn't quite sure which way he wanted to go. A French diplomat wrote a brief query on behalf of Kristofovich, and that seems to have been enough to get him in the Release to the West group. So he made his way to Italy, then to France. He couldn't get a work permit, was struggling in France, thought if he could only get to America, that might be, what he would, that might be the place of opportunity. So he was cleaning hotel rooms illegally without a work permit. He explored a illegal marriage to an American, but one of the hotel rooms that he cleaned was being taken by a young American woman who was working for the Marshall Plan. And she was very impressed by him, and she persuaded her parents in Portland, Oregon, to sponsor his way to come to the U.S. They'd never met him. They took a risk on him, and it didn't solve the global refugee problem. Didn't really make a whisker of a difference in the global refugee problem. But for Vladislav Kristofovich, it was transformational, and for me too, because when he came to the U.S., he decided Kristofovich was way too complicated, had 3 Z's, so he shortened his name to Kristof, is my dad. And, I think it's a reminder of the drops in the bucket. That's how you fill buckets.
Good story, huh? I'd love to get comments, questions from you all. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. And wait for... I'll do 3 at once here, and just wait for the microphone to get to you. We'll start in the back, and then we'll start with Maureen, and then we'll get some other ones.
Hi, I'm Maureen Quinn here at the International Peace Institute. I came in a little late, but you were talking around, to me, what I heard you saying was the validity and the usefulness of randomized controlled trials. There are humanitarian and development experts who are opposed to them because they're random, so they're not impartial. So I'd like to hear your views on that issue. Thank you.
Sure. I'm a huge fan of them. Now, they're basically because they give one solid evidence. And there's so many things that we kind of think will work. And so microloans were one example I used, clean cook stoves another, that when you actually did careful studies, they turned out to be much less effective than we thought. And other things that, like micro savings, that turn out to be much more effective. Deworming, that turn out to be much more effective. I think it gives us a much clearer sense of what works. Now, you know, it's true that these, there are various complaints against them. One is that they're expensive to do. And indeed, after Half the Sky, I mean, we introduced mobile games in Kenya and in India to try to use mobile phones to change behaviors on taking women to the hospital to deliver babies and to encourage deworming. And the idea was that these are free games in cheap mobile phones. There's often no television, no other entertainment in these villages. Playtime was free, and so we thought, well, this is a way of getting people to play fun games that would have a lesson that maybe and we couldn't get the funding to do a randomized control trial to test whether they would actually make. So we came up with our own evaluation. Says they worked brilliantly. You know, I think it's hard to know unless you actually have that level of randomization.
Great. Right here.
Catherine Dumay Harper, it's wonderful to see you again, Nick. In my time with MSF, our paths crossed a few times. I'm a big fan of you. Reading most of your op-ed, including the last one, very moving, about your poor and obese friend in Oregon. My question is, I cannot wait to read your book. Are you raising the issue of ethics in terms of some organization? Because if you are a big philanthropist or a very small donor, sometimes you can make a mistake where you give your money. And about frustration in the news, I share that with you. And may I say that I was very frustrated with you and disappointed when you wrote that op-ed on Woody Allen a year ago. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we'll agree to disagree on that op-ed. You know, I mean, there's no doubt that philanthropists make mistakes all the time in the way they spend money. I think that the biggest mistake, though, is often that most philanthropy in this country really isn't geared toward the needy. It's geared toward, I mean, a lot of it is basically kind of self-help. In other words, if, you know, in New York, it's quite easy. There's certainly a pattern, we all know it, where somebody essentially gets a tax subsidy for, I mean, it's, since you get the tax deduction, the median taxpayer in the country is subsidizing a large donation to a private school, say, which will then get you on the board of that school, which will further your professional network, which will then increase the chance that your kids or grandkids are going to get in that school. And the kids going to that school are all way above median incomes, and yet this is being subsidized by the median taxpayer. And as best we can figure out, about 1/6 of charitable donations actually go to people who are, you know, classically needy. So I think the whole nonprofit world needs something of a revolution. And I think that we as givers, you know, we screw up. We give to people who ask. We get a phone call, or, you know, from, and somebody mentions, it's a marketing call, and somebody mentions children with cancer, or they mention disabled veterans, and we sort of freeze and, okay, here's X amount. We don't know anything about the organization on the other end of the line. We would never buy a television that way. And it is, I think we've been, I think, too focused on, I think Charity Navigator in some ways has had kind of a bad effect on us because we've become so focused on administrative expense ratios, which at some level are relevant. I mean, obviously you don't want to donate to an organization so it'll build itself a beautiful, huge marble foyer. But on the other hand, what matters is impact. And sometimes more administrative expenses are going to improve that impact. They're going to increase that impact. And I wish that, I think that we need to improve our giving and don't get me started on this profusion of tiny, there are too many nonprofits. It'd be wonderful if there were a little more M&A in the nonprofit sector. But there's, a large subject.
All right. In the far back.
Hi. Hi, I'm Iselin Larsen from the Norwegian Mission. Thank you very much for coming in. It's really interesting to hear your thought. I think a lot of us are trying to wrap our heads around your point about why people switch channels when important news come on the TV. And I guess one of the dangers or threats with the reduction of number of people reading print media is that, your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, you choose yourself. So I choose to follow you, but I can choose to not follow any international news. And I think maybe there's a danger of becoming even more narrow-minded because we decide ourselves what we want to see and not see. With the print media, you would have scrolled past those, but at least you would have been exposed to it. So you mentioned that marketing is one way that, the NGO world and our world, we should become better at. But are there other things that you think that we can do more to, to get especially young kids to follow yourself and others? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that I've wrestled with. I wrestled with it initially when I was covering Darfur, and you may remember if at that same time, it always felt like I was going off to Darfur, and I'd write these columns. It just felt like they were disappearing without a ripple. And meanwhile, at the same time, here in New York, there were these two red-tailed hawks in Central Park. Do you remember that? Pale Male and... Can't remember Pale Male's wife's name, but they were living in a nest.
My sister can.
Lola, that's right. Lola, and they were evicted from their nest, and all New York was up in arms about these two homeless hawks. And I couldn't generate the same outrage about hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered in Darfur. And I thought, what is wrong with my writing? And that led me to the work of some folks in social psychology and in neuroscience who look at precisely this question of what connects us to a cause, what makes us empathetic, what makes us want to respond. And the lessons are kind of twofold, and they suggest that everything that NGOs and journalists do are exactly wrong. One of the lessons has to do with numbers, that I think we all sort of intuitively know that at some point, if the numbers get too big, that then we just sort of tune out. Well, the point at which we begin to tune out is when n equals 2. The moment we have more empathy for a single child or a single person, and the moment it even rises to 2, then our empathy diminishes. There were a bunch of experiments asking people to donate to save the children using different marketing techniques. And one was, you can help this particular child, 7-year-old Rokia from Mali. And the moment they added a boy, you can help Rokia and this boy, donations fell. And when they asked, said there are 14 million people malnourished in West Africa, please help, nobody gave, essentially. It starts with individuals, and it's not a rational process. It's an emotional one. It's an emotional pathway. In one of the experiments, they asked people to do math problems first to kind of get the more rational parts of the brain in the fore, and then people donated less after having done these math problems. The other lesson, aside from kind of numbers and emotion, is the importance of being positive. We in journalism, we're always covering planes that crash, not planes that take off. NGOs are always saying how awful things are because they're trying to raise money to address crises. But I think that the risk is that we leave people with the impression that everything is failing. And that this efforts against global poverty are kind of a catastrophe. And people are much more inclined to donate to something that seems successful, that shows impact, than something that seems terrible. And so I think indeed with both Half the Sky and With a Path Appears, I mean, we tried to incorporate those messages, and we tell a lot of individual stories, and those individual stories will sometimes plumb great depths of despair, but there will be an arc that will show that there can be better outcomes. And maybe that can help address some of this, the way we tune out.
I want to see how many questions I've got. I'm going to take about 3 at once so that I'll start there, second here, and third there. And we'll take 3 and then answer them all at once.
My name is Katja Iversen. I come from an organization called Women Deliver. And as we would normally say, women deliver and not only babies. And I think your writing really shows that. So thanks a lot for that. Of course, kind of coming from an NGO, it's a little fun when we talk about how it doesn't work. We are some of those that put focus on what happens well and what goes well, and focus on solution and impact. I just come from a big forum on women's health over at the UN these 2 days. And of course, what happens in the UN is big, and it's big numbers. It's not the individuals. But I would like to hear your comment on some of the discussions that's happening on the Sustainable Development Goals, the bigger framework. I totally agree that we have to focus on the individual, but there's also something called structures that needs to be in place, whether it's we talk gender equality, or we talk health, or we talk women's economic empowerment and possibilities. So I'd love to hear your thinking on that. Thank you.
Hold that thought. In the front row? No, she's right there.
Oh, thank you. Excuse my voice.
Hold it very close.
Better now?
Yeah, this is for the webcast.
Excuse me?
It's for the webcast, that's why.
Oh, I see. My name is Ann Phillips. I'm a member of the board of IPI. I just wanted to emphasize something that you said before and give an illustration of it. The fact that when media focuses on an issue, the response of giving is greater. I was on the board for many years of Save the Children, which you referred to. And you will remember years ago, there was a severe famine in Ethiopia. And the media showed pictures of it every night for many, many weeks. Well, that was a transformative moment for Save the Children, because we suddenly became from a very substantive organization to an international one with millions and millions of dollars. It was fascinating to see it and very rewarding. So I just wanted to emphasize what you said is entirely accurate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. And I think number 3, thank you.
Thank you. Francisco Bozano Burns, Tenure and Ecology. There's been a few questions in the direction of why focus so much on the individual and not deal with the whole systemic issues. As a background, I played a role in bringing Spain to democracy, and that required an enormous amount of organization, and it wasn't money. Money played somewhat of a role. It was mostly mutual aid. And I think that why do we focus so much on the individual and forget about policy, forget about collective phenomenon, when the poor people really, they bet mostly not on becoming rich, but on helping one another in most situations, because they don't have more than just their energy in their locality, their access to their resources. Why always this giving from the rich to the poor and always on an individual basis? Is this going to produce systemic change? Isn't it why we feel that we're not being effective? Isn't it why people are not giving? Because there isn't any kind of policy and clear analysis and strategic vision. I mean, where are the Luther Kings? Where are the Washingtons? Where are the great minds?
Okay, got it. Go.
So first on the MDGs and Sustainable Development Goals, the MDGs, I think, accomplished. I mean, I think they did focus people's minds in particular countries on particular metrics, and I think they were useful in that sense. I thought that it was a bit of a lost opportunity, and I'm afraid the Sustainable Development Goals will be as well, because they don't capture public imagination. I mean, the moment you have so many goals and so many sub-goals, it becomes. I mean, I write about these issues all the time, and I almost never use the word Millennium Development Goal because. In the times I can't use MDG because nobody knows what it is. I can't use Millennium Development Goals, nobody knows what that is. And if I explain what it is, I've used 2 sentences and risk losing another 10,000 readers in those 2 sentences. And I'm afraid Sustainable Development Goals will be the same way. I mean, if it were my druthers, I would, again, use a little more sort of the marketing focus and maybe have 3 or 4, something that would be more memorable, and then go on from there to the particular metrics, which I do think are so important to hold countries accountable, give them something to measure. On the question of sort of systemic versus individual, there's no doubt that we need systemic solutions, and I mean, essentially you need both. I mean, but I always think of the interstate highway system. You would never ask people to build interstate highways with bake sales or asking people to go out with a shovel and do another square foot of highway. There are some kinds of interventions that we have to do broadly. But how do we get there? I think that advocacy is one important way to get people to engage. I mean, essentially, there are 3 ways of getting people to engage: advocacy, donation, and volunteering. And I think that that all of the above is necessary. But I would push back at the idea that individual efforts are meaningless. And I guess there's a broader question about kind of top-down versus bottom-up efforts. I tend to think that internationally in development, we've been too focused on top-down interventions, and they've tended to work pretty well on health care. So smallpox eradication, absolutely. Right now, guinea worm eradication, absolutely. Female genital mutilation, kind of a failure, top-down. Since the 1970s, I don't know how many meetings have been held, laws passed in country after country that had essentially no effect. In Guinea, it's illegal to cut your daughter, sometimes punishable by execution. 99% of girls still cut. And sometimes I think the effort to create laws, treaties, international conventions becomes not a spur to action, but a substitute for it. And in fact, with FGM, now you have grassroots organizations in a bunch of countries in Senegal, in Ghana, in Egypt, that actually are having an effect on FGM, but it's in a way that the top-down efforts didn't. So, I mean, I think you need kind of all of the above. You need top-down, bottom-up, sideways, government, philanthropists, take anything one can get and see what sticks.
I'll take 3 more. In the second row here, the second row there, and the first row. 1, 2, 3.
Hi there, Harriet Mandel of the Global Roundtable. Thank you very much for really your magnificent contributions to raising awareness on all of these issues. I love your columns, and I thank you for what you inspire. I have 2 questions. One is cultural, about American. I haven't read the book, but I assume you're talking about American philanthropy. Are you focusing on American philanthropy? So my first question would be generational. Have you looked at all into the difference between my generation, let's say, my children's generation, and now my grandchildren's generation, the millennials? what are they thinking? What are they thinking about philanthropy? How is the tech world affecting their ideas about giving? That's number one. And number two is there are some internal tensions, I think, within American culture. On the one hand, correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard that we are probably the most philanthropic society in the world, and part of that may be because we're private, as opposed to many other governments where the governments, in fact, take care of the giving, public giving, if you will. I don't know if I'm correct on that. And the second thing is I'm taking some courses at Columbia, some liberal arts courses at my age again, and it's fascinating because there's a lot of conversation out there about liberal arts education. And when you were talking about the elite class being less empathetic, that might be the class, of course, that goes to these wonderful liberal arts colleges that inspired with ideas of charity and kindness and to look at the world in a way that that makes the individual more empathetic. And you can go in many different directions with this liberal arts education, but I would imagine that one of them would be to inspire the kind of ideas that we're discussing here with regards to philanthropy. So, and the other hand, we're a very individualistic society. And we say, stand on your own 2 feet, you know, get yourself together, and on and on. So if you can comment on these, I'd appreciate that.
Those are 3 questions right there. Well, we'll keep going. Number 2 was here, wasn't it? Oh, 1, 2 there. Very good.
Hi, I'm Andrea Osunluvan. I work here at IPI. So thanks so much for being with us tonight. You've discussed tonight the efforts to quantify and measure the benefits for the individual of giving. There's also an emerging movement to do the same for the business world, sometimes called conscious capitalism or by other names. So I was wondering if you think that it's realistic that that will expand and really take hold in the coming years, or if really we'll need regulation and international treaties to make progress in that area. Thank
And
you.
who did I name number 3? Do you know who you are? Here in the front row. And we've got a bunch of other ones. So.
Great. Dennis Bennett from Afrograins. First, I want to thank you for all that you've done for writing about South Sudan. We've been working there for the last 16 years, so lots of good stuff that came out as a result of your quiet advocacy, even when you didn't know that it was being being listened to. I'd like you to comment on or think about the intersection of food security, which is one of those SDG goals, food security with women's rights, education, child soldiers, and post-conflict, right? When you have a food security where the girls are the farmers, they can't go to school, they're illiterate, they're the farmers, the boys are excess mouths to feed, they get kicked out of the house, especially in South Sudan, they have 3 choices. Get starved to death, get eaten by lions, or join a militia, child soldiers. Where do the child soldiers and the militias go? Conflict. So would love to have your thoughts on that.
Okay.
Good, easy problems to solve.
That's right.
I'll be going back to South Sudan sometime this spring before the rainy season. So, on the question of generational philanthropy, I'm a great believer in millennials. I think millennials, by and large, have been. We don't really have good data yet because they're at a stage of the life cycle that are where they're not big givers, but they seem, for example, much more engaged in sort of pro-social activities, and I think that this is one thing that is going to change corporate behavior. That I mentioned earlier, that corporate social responsibility has basically been window dressing. I think that there is a growing understanding on the part of companies that if you want to compete for the best and brightest young people, that one form of compensation is not just their paycheck, but also the perception that this is a good company that is doing good in the world, that has a CSR program that is real, and likewise in terms of marketing your brand, that people make their shopping decisions, millennials make their shopping decisions in a way that others don't. And I think investment decisions that, traditionally we had this sort of bifurcation that we would take a bit of money at the end of the year and give it away entirely. We never wanted to see it again. And that would go 100% for charity. And then we'd have another bit of money that we'd want to put into our retirement savings, and that we wanted to have no social purpose whatsoever, and just be for ourselves. And in fact, I think with this generation, this kind of goes a little bit to your conscious capitalism question, that there are going to be things in between. And with social responsibility investing, with impact investing, with there are these B corporations, which are for-profit companies that also have a social purpose, or double bottom line companies, triple bottom line companies. And I think there's going to be, in general, much more blending of for-profit models in the socially responsible sphere. The U.S. is not generous at all in terms of government development aid, humanitarian aid. It is very generous in terms of private aid. And then there are various efforts to try to quantify things like taking in refugees and this kind that are much harder to generate. But in general, I'd say we're not on the public sphere. We lag. On the private sphere, we do pretty well. The conscious capitalism question, I'm a huge believer in it. Impact investing, I think this is really a direction we're going to see a lot more of. On these, one of the lessons I've learned from South Sudan, Chad, Central African Republic, is that before anything else, you kind of need security. And that if you don't have security, you can't do education, you can't do healthcare, you can't do anything. I remember once in Central African Republic coming across a nice clinic that had a little plaque saying, gift of the German aid agency. And there was nothing there. It had been looted by a militia, everything taken, the staff had fled, and in contexts like that, you just desperately want somebody to come in and provide security. And once security is, one of the things we've also learned, again, from Africa, both from Central Africa, Rwanda's genocide leaching into Burundi and to Congo, now the most lethal conflict since World War II, and then West Africa, what happened in Liberia leaching into Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire, that conflict is so contagious. And I think we need early warning systems not only for famine, but also for conflict. And one study found that the average African civil war imposed, I think, $76 billion in economic costs alone. Sometimes peacekeepers or sometimes really intense diplomacy early on is going to avert that economic and humanitarian catastrophe. Once, it's not always going to help, but sometimes it can. And once, look at Syria right now. There are no good solutions for Syria. A few years ago, I think maybe there were. And the network, the system you describe is absolutely right. And these all feed into each other. And when you miss nutrition for these kids, for the next 60 years, their cognitive function is going to be impaired. They are not going to be contributing to their economy as effectively because in 2015, those kids are not getting adequate nutrition. It's something that resilience, in that respect, is much less than what we think.
Let me go to the back of the room. Bill, number 1, number 2, and number 3. 1, 2, 3.
Bill Blakemore, correspondent for about 4.5 years, decades.
Bill, hold it up a bit.
Sorry. I wonder, Nick, is there any way in which the general patterns that you all have discovered of what works in people who want to make a difference in places where there's suffering overseas might be applied to what's increasingly now described, including now finally by the New York Times, as the biggest problem of all that's going to soon, if not already, cause the biggest amount of suffering, the impossibly big man-made global warming problem? Is there any way in which the patterns you've discovered of what works might be applied to that story too big to cover, as it's sometimes called?
Excellent. And Eddie, I think?
Eddie Mandry with NYU Africa House. My question is around the 2012 campaign, Kony 2012. It was exceedingly successful in as far as getting the attention of hundreds of millions of people. I understand they had a subsequent video that wasn't that popular. To this day, Joseph Kony is still at large. And even, there was US resources put to bear to try and support the search for Joseph Kony. So with regard to, its success in getting attention to this issue, but still not being able to quite, drill down and arrest Joseph Kony, what lessons can we learn from that campaign?
Eddie, just pass that to the gentleman right there. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Alan Seckler. I'm at the UN
Hold up.
working... Hello?
Yeah, very good.
That's right. Hello, my name is Alan Seckler. I'm working at the United Nations in peacekeeping. And thank you so much for your presence here. It's a pleasure to meet you in person. And I'm an avid reader of your op-eds and your book, which you just published. I have been concerned for some time with the systemic issue of corruption at the highest levels, which kind of have transformed into kleptomanic networks in many countries. And I would submit to you that is one of the reasons why a number of countries do not emerge, or at least one of the major reasons why, and it has very detrimental effects, both in the country, this generations and future generations, but also international stability and peace and international security at large. And I was wondering whether humanitarian actors would have some solutions with regard to working together with political actors, the military, other actors, to try to come up with some solutions which would try to address this issue. I would have submit to you that maybe some of the elements of disinterest or lack of response from audiences is that people do not see humanitarian actors and others address sufficiently and straightforwardly square on this issue. What would be your approach to this? Thank you.
On the first question about climate change, it's a great question. And I think that the challenge is, the same as in addressing Central African Republic refugees, that it's something that is very hard to build empathy for. I remember talking to evolutionary biologists who were saying, look, we're hardwired through evolution to be afraid of snakes and to be afraid of spiders, because in evolutionary times that was a useful thing to be afraid of. But we're not wired to be afraid of slightly increasing temperatures, and that in general, we're not wired to be afraid of things that happen gradually. Now, in the last few 100,000 years, we've made modest gains in rationalities, and that's why we save for our retirement and this kind of thing, but we're not very good at it yet. And I think climate change is absolutely an example of that. And I think we in the media are part of the problem because of this tendency to say, well, Mr. Smith says this and Mrs. Jones says that, and who's to know? One of the lessons from development, or one of the parallels, is that some of the research suggests that some of the most effective ways to address carbon emissions, say in 75 years, is something that is also hugely powerful in addressing conflict, addressing so many other issues in development, and that is reducing population growth. And how do you do that? Well, in turn, girls' education tends to be just about the most powerful way to reduce population growth. And it doesn't do much, having population control programs doesn't do much for carbon emissions in the short term. Partly, these countries are emitting very, very little carbon right now. Those folks who do the math say that if you're trying to figure out how to reduce carbon emissions in the year 2100, then by far the cheapest, most cost-effective way is to reduce population growth right now in fast-growing countries, and that's something I think we kind of actually at this point sort of know how to do. That if there's political will to do it. On Coney 2012 and selectivism generally, I'm actually a bit of a supporter of the selectivist campaigns, and I would even cite Coney 2012 as an example of a success. It did not catch Coney. Joseph Coney we believe he's in this area controlled by Sudan on the South Sudan border. But attacks by the LRA have fallen more than 90% since 2012. Places like northeastern Congo, DRC, that were just devastated by the LRA are now okay, and the more or less number two under Coney was he just surrendered. So I wish the results were better. I want to write a column when Joseph Coney is arrested. I want to interview him behind bars somewhere. But I do think that it is important to note that the attacks have diminished, and I think that the campaign gets some credit for it, and the U.S. force and pushing Uganda, this kind of thing. The Bring Back Our Girls campaign, very disappointing in terms of those girls aren't back. On the other hand, I do think it has elevated the issue of girls' education. I suspect that girls' education in the region is probably getting a little bit more support, a little bit more attention from security forces than it would otherwise. But it's, that was also a case where we in the media kind of dropped the ball on the Nigerian girls. It was Twitter campaigns starting in Nigeria that forced us to pay attention. Corruption. There's sort of an interesting debate, I think. Folks whose focus has been on in Africa and in South Asia tend to think corruption is a huge economic impediment. People whose careers were more in East Asia think, who could be more corrupt than Taiwan or Indonesia or South Korea, and didn't stop them. And I've wondered about this because those countries were incredibly corrupt. China is incredibly corrupt. On balance, though, I do think you're right that corruption really has been a major impediment. In Chad, one study about support for rural health clinics found that for every dollar intended to go to these rural health clinics, only 3 cents arrived, and that's kind of reflective of all kinds of programs. I think it creates often ethnic tensions in countries because the corruption reflects how spoils are done. It impairs all kind of delivery of services because schools aren't built. There's a ghost school, and the money just goes to the Department of Education, to the Secretary of Education, and is never built. I think that we are beginning to get some better tools to address this. I think that that international community can do a much better job promoting transparency. We're beginning to see some of this with transparency initiatives where foreign companies will have to stipulate what money is paid so that people in that country can see what money is going into that country. I think that is helpful. I think the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has been somewhat helpful in terms of U.S. companies. But there are two countries that I know of, or two places that I know of, that essentially eliminated ordinary bribes overnight. One was Georgia, one was Hong Kong. And in each case, the strategy was exactly the same, that there was incredible political will overnight to fire anybody caught taking a bribe or offering a bribe. In Hong Kong, you had little old ladies who were so accustomed to this is what you do, and she offers a bribe. All of a sudden, she's in handcuffs, and that meant that the little old ladies aren't offering bribes anymore, and then the policemen are nervous to ask because then they might get into trouble, and it created this virtuous cycle. So I don't think it's totally impossible, and I do think your instinct is absolutely right. The donor countries and kind of monitors can do a much better job monitoring that corruption, pushing for transparency, and kind of naming and shaming the big offenders.
I know there are additional questions, but I want to give Nick time to sign books, and I'm going to keep him right here. I'll give him a glass of wine if he wants, and just come forward, and maybe you can ask the questions of him individually as he signs the books. Nick, I've been thinking, sitting here, remembering writing that memo, not knowing it was being hacked into by all the clerks, and also they were feeding it to you. But what a smart guy I was to think that there was a future in this guy. And it's been wonderful for me, Nick, personally, to see. I know it because I read the column, but it's just been great to see you personally. And I know I'm speaking for that tribe. We really appreciate your coming here and speaking so openly and thoroughly and candidly. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.